Hey everybody, Professor Snart, just a quick check-in here as we actually get through our last couple of units in the course, which is hard to believe. Uh, we are currently looking at Unit 7, or we've just passed Unit 7, Worldly Encounters, and we're working on the next that's sort of a paired set of units, Unit 8 and 9, both kind of this overarching theme of the modern world, quote unquote, and then notions of how modernist movements, again, very generally speaking, tend to be challenges to the past. So really thinking of contemporary work, at least relative to where we started the class, and how unlike literary history up to a certain point, it's sort of simplistic to say, but at a certain point, right, there's nothing that really comes before you or no body of work that you necessarily have to contend with, no traditions that are set in stone, even though the early writing may have literally been set in stone. But at some point, one of the kind of elements that impacts art and writing specifically, it sort of becomes more and more the accumulation of tradition behind you. And so, as we move into sort of the contemporary scene, and again, not just the last, 10 years, but the last few hundred years worth of literary tradition, more and more, increasingly, we see artists responding to what had come before. And so this occurs in a variety of ways, obviously. We see responses or reactions against certain literary traditions or conventions or patterns. We see movement back to earlier traditions. We see in lots of modernist thinking this sort of dual approach, like T.S. Eliot is a perfect example. He's both deeply traditional. He returns to classics of Western literature, but he often does so in this very original kind of way. So the juxtaposition or the transposition of fragments from very traditional sources like Dante, for example, someone we've read, or people like Milton, biblical tradition, all of that kind of stuff, but brought together in this new kind of this new way that's really in some way built on fragments. And in fact, that is what makes it new, not the material per se, but often the presentation of that material. The modernist art form of collage is a good example, again, of working with old, quote unquote, traditional material, but collecting it in these new ways, of presenting it to readers or to viewers in these new ways. So we enter a period in this modern, and again, very generally speaking, this modern period, that is both a reworking of tradition, a rejection of tradition, a celebration of tradition. We see all of these things happening sometimes at once in the same work of art. So the Unit 8 and 9 then are both looking at ways that the contemporary scene sort of addresses ideas of tradition. We also see lots of challenges to tradition, if not kind of literary or artistic convention, then certainly social convention. So that's one of the other things that we begin to look at, is how writers become socially active and aware. Not become, but that becomes a maybe increasingly obvious component for some artists' work. It was there throughout the literary canon that we've looked at, but again, comes into maybe sharper focus during this literary era, again, very broadly speaking. And that will bring us eventually next week, next Thursday, our final due date, to Unit 10, which is the very last unit in our course. I'll talk more about that as we get a little bit closer to it, but just be aware of kind of how close to the end we are. Be sure you're staying on track. It's just fantastic writing that's being done. Again, really well-developed essays, but also great responses to people. And like I've said before, you know how it feels as the writer to see someone respond to your work in that depth, to know that they've spent the time, obviously responding to your work, but clearly reading it carefully first. That feels really good. Let's be honest about it. So keep that in mind when you're responding to people, that part of what you're doing is honoring the work that they've initially put into what is hopefully a really great essay. And so you can kind of celebrate that in a a response that shows that you've really been engaged with what they're talking about. Okay, so keep your eyes on these due dates here as we roll right to the end of our course, and I will be back in touch in a couple days. And as usual, if you have any questions or concerns, be in touch with me right away.